A lonely, elderly man is walking down the street and suddenly he hears, "Uncle, take my sister away. She wants to eat." Turning around, he sees a dark-skinned boy with a baby in his arms. Little did he know that this chance encounter would change everything. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. What city are you from? Write in the comments. The mornings in Willow Creek were always still, with the sort of quiet that settled deep into your bones as if the world itself had paused to breathe. It was the kind of town where everything seemed draped in soft light, where people moved at a gentler pace, and where the world's noise, the ambition, the urgency, the harshness, faded somewhere between the clapboard houses and whispering pines. It was exactly the kind of place Harold Blake had been looking for. Harold had arrived 3 days earlier in a black sedan with darkened windows, not unlike a visiting dignitary, though there was no fanfare, no waving neighbors. He had rented a large colonial-style home on the edge of town, a white-painted structure with green shutters and a creaky porch swing that hadn't moved in years. The real estate agent had talked too much, trying to impress him with stories about the town's heritage and the celebrities who had once passed through. Harold hadn't cared. He wasn't there for nostalgia or for peace. He was there for silence. Not just the kind that surrounded him, but the kind he hoped to feel within himself. He was a man of 70 now, with thinning silver hair and skin weathered not just by sun, but by loss. The money had always been there, stacked high and neat, built from a lifetime in construction and real estate. But money had proven a terrible comfort in grief. His wife had died slowly, cancer eating her from the inside out, and his daughter had followed unexpectedly just 3 years later in a car accident on a rainy Texas highway. After that, Harold had withdrawn. From the boardrooms, from his charities, from everyone. He gave up the chairmanship, sold off his most active holdings, and told his assistant to find him somewhere far away from anything that reminded him of the life he had lost. Each morning, Harold followed a ritual. He would wake before the sun, make himself a pot of strong black coffee, and sit on the porch until the sky turned from navy to pale gold. Then he would take the long route into town, walking slowly, though his steps were still steady and his back remained straight. His destination was always the same, a small cafe called Miss Annie's, tucked at the corner of Main Street, where the scent of fresh cinnamon rolls wafted through the open door and where the waitress never asked too many questions. He liked that. He liked not being asked. The town's residents had already begun whispering about the quiet old man with expensive shoes and a gaze that never lingered on anyone for long. Some thought he was a retired judge, others said a novelist. No one guessed correctly, and Harold preferred it that way. On the 4th morning of his stay, Harold finished his coffee a little later than usual. The cafe had been unusually full, and a group of high schoolers had taken up the best table near the window, laughing too loudly. He'd tried to ignore them, but their youthful noise had clawed at the quiet he had cultivated like a prized garden. So he left his tip, adjusted the collar of his gray wool coat, and stepped out into the cool morning air. The sun was already up, casting long golden slants of light across the sidewalk. He walked slowly, thinking perhaps he'd stop by the bookstore or pick up more fruit at the market. He wasn't sure. Planning had become irrelevant in his life. He did what he wanted, when he wanted, though more often than not, that amounted to very little. And then he saw him. At first, Harold thought the child was simply loitering. A boy, maybe 6 or 7, sitting on the edge of a bus bench at the far end of the street. The boy was hunched over something wrapped in cloth, his shoulders pulled in tightly, like he was trying to disappear into the shadows cast by the shelter. It was odd, Harold thought, for a child that young to be alone so early in the morning. Stranger still was the fact that no adult was nearby, no mother with a stroller, no father fiddling with keys or a phone. Harold slowed his pace, unsure why. He told himself it was nothing, just a boy waiting for a ride, or perhaps one of those modern parenting experiments where children were encouraged to be independent. But there was something about the boy's stillness, the way he kept his eyes fixed on the sidewalk, that made Harold pause. The child wasn't just waiting, he was holding something. No, someone. As Harold stepped closer, his breath caught. The boy was cradling an infant, a baby, swaddled in a grimy blanket that looked too thin for the chill in the air. The baby's face was barely visible, but Harold could see a tuft of tightly coiled dark hair and the soft rise and fall of tiny breaths. The boy tightened his arms protectively around the bundle, as if afraid that even Harold's gaze might harm her. Harold froze. He looked around instinctively, expecting to see a mother emerge from a shop, perhaps a father running late, but no one came. The boy looked up, finally meeting Harold's eyes. His face was smudged with dirt, his lips dry and cracked, and in his expression there was something far too heavy for such a small body to carry. It wasn't just tiredness, it was fear, it was hope. It was a look of someone who had waited too long and run out of time. Harold opened his mouth, but no words came. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so completely disoriented by something so simple as a child's gaze. The boy shifted his weight and stood up slowly, the baby still pressed to his chest. He was thin, painfully so, with a coat that hung off his shoulders like it had belonged to someone else. The boy stepped forward, hesitant, his eyes scanning Harold's face for something. Compassion, maybe, or safety. Harold didn't move. He just stood there, hands at his sides, coat catching the breeze. The boy said something then, a quiet murmur that Harold barely heard over the wind. It was just a few words, but they pierced him cleanly, without warning, slipping past the walls he had spent a lifetime building. He said, "Sir, please, can you take my sister?" And Harold blinked. The world didn't stop, not exactly, but it shifted. He wasn't in Willow Creek anymore. He wasn't in the present. He was back on a rainy street in Dallas, watching the news reporters swarm the wreckage of his daughter's car. He was hearing the last voicemail she'd left him, one he hadn't returned. He was remembering the way his granddaughter had laughed the summer before she and her mother vanished from his life forever. The boy before him was not his family. The baby was not his blood, but the pain in that child's voice was too familiar, too raw, and Harold, who had always been a man of plans, of structure, of control, felt something give way inside him. He stepped closer, not entirely sure what he was doing, only that he couldn't walk away. Not this time. And somewhere, beneath the silence he had worn like armor, a new sound stirred. It was the faintest thing, but it was real. It was the sound of a door opening. Harold Blake had never considered himself a man swayed by sentiment. Life had taught him that emotion was a dangerous indulgence, especially for a man of his position. But, as he stood on that sidewalk, the cool morning breeze curling around his legs, and stared into the eyes of the boy who had just asked him to take his infant sister, something shifted within him. It was not a grand epiphany or a cinematic flood of emotion, just a quiet click, like a lock tumbling open after years of being sealed. The boy's voice had been soft, almost drowned out by the whisper of the wind, but its weight was undeniable. The child couldn't have been more than 6, maybe 7 at most. He stood with the weariness of someone who had waited too long without answers, who had carried too much for far too long. His arms clutched the swaddled bundle against his chest as if she were a part of his own body. His jacket hung past his hands, clearly not his size, and his jeans were threadbare at the knees. His shoes, too tight or too loose, Harold couldn't tell, were scuffed beyond recognition. The baby, her face barely visible beneath the folds of a dingy blanket, stirred softly. Her cheeks were sunken, her lips dry, and she made a faint, breathy whimper, the kind that made Harold's heart stumble in his chest. The old man swallowed against a dry throat. Everything in him screamed for reason, for structure, for a protocol he could follow. But there was no guidebook for this. He couldn't look away, and the boy didn't look like he could stand much longer. "Wait here," Harold said, his voice scratchy and uncertain, a poor echo of his once commanding tone. He turned on his heel and walked briskly back toward the cafe. Miss Annie's was still bustling with the late morning crowd, though the air inside smelled more like coffee grounds and sugar now. He caught the eye of the young waitress who had served him earlier and gestured to her. "Those kids outside," he said, keeping his voice low. "Do you know anything about them?" She glanced past him toward the bus bench, her face softening with concern. "They've been around for a few days now. I've seen the little boy sitting out there with that baby every morning, never with an adult. A few people tried talking to him, but he gets scared easy, won't let anyone take the baby, just says he's waiting for his mama." Harold felt his stomach tighten. Waiting for his mama. 3 days, alone, in the cold, feeding a baby. How? He turned back toward the door. "Hey," the waitress called after him. "You gonna call someone, like the police?" He didn't answer. Not because he hadn't heard, but because he didn't yet know. As he returned to the children, the boy was right where Harold had left him, standing with that same stillness, the baby cradled close, his eyes watching Harold's every move with a cautious blend of hope and fear. Harold knelt down slowly in front of him, his knees protesting with a sharp pang. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Malik," the boy answered after a long pause. "And your sister?" "Skay," he said, barely audible. "But Mama called her Sky, like the sky." Harold nodded. "She's hungry, isn't she?" Malik didn't answer, but his eyes dropped to the baby. She gave another soft cry. That was answer enough. Harold looked around, then held out a hand, not to take the baby, but to offer something. Trust, maybe. "I'm going to get her something to eat," he said, "and you too. You can come with me, just let me help." Malik hesitated, glancing down at his sister, then back at Harold. It was the kind of decision a child should never have to make, whether to trust a stranger or continue braving the streets alone. Finally, Malik gave a single nod. The nearest market was 3 blocks away, and Harold decided not to push them too far. Instead, he walked the children back toward the cafe. Malik followed silently, clutching his sister, his footsteps small and hesitant but determined. Inside, people glanced up. Some watched them curiously. Others looked away. Harold ignored them all. He ordered scrambled eggs, toast, fruit, and 2 bottles of milk. While they waited, he asked the staff for warm water and a clean cloth. In the corner booth, Malik sat curled with the baby against his chest. Harold noticed how naturally he rocked her, how gently he adjusted her position when she stirred. This child had learned parenting in desperation, and he had learned it well. When the food came, Malik ate with restrained urgency, feeding himself only after checking on his sister. Harold offered to hold the baby while he ate, and though the boy hesitated, he eventually nodded and passed the bundle over with a kind of reverence. Harold took her carefully, his arms stiff at first, afraid to harm something so delicate. She was impossibly small, warm and fragile, her breath tickling the inside of his elbow. Holding her, Harold felt something unfamiliar and disquieting, something dangerously close to tenderness. She didn't cry, just nestled into him with a quiet sigh that nearly undid him. After the meal, Malik carefully wiped the baby's mouth with a napkin, then looked up at Harold with eyes far too serious for his age. "We don't have anywhere else to go," he said plainly. Harold nodded. "Where's your mother?" Malik looked down at the table. "She said she'd be back soon, but it's been a long time." "How long?" Malik shrugged, but then whispered, 4 nights. The silence that followed felt impossibly loud. Harold ran a hand down his face. He had lived through corporate disasters, market crashes, legal battles, but nothing had ever made him feel as unmoored as he did sitting in a small-town cafe with 2 children who didn't belong to him, whose lives were hanging by a thread no one else seemed to notice. And the boy had asked him to take his sister, not out of convenience or fear, but as a last act of hope. After paying, Harold made another decision, one that surprised even himself. He couldn't send them back outside. Not again. Not with the night coming. The air was already turning sharper, and the idea of those children sleeping on a bench another night made his chest ache in a way he hadn't felt in years. "We're going to my place," he said softly. "Just for the night. You both need rest and warmth." Malik looked up at him, fear dancing behind his lashes. "You won't call the cops?" Harold paused, the question hitting harder than expected. "No," he said finally. "Not unless we have to." That night, the house Harold had once found suffocatingly quiet was transformed. He lit the fireplace for the first time in years, its warmth filling the living room while Malik sat on the floor, rocking Sky in his lap. Harold brought out blankets, towels, and one of his old dress shirts for Malik to wear as pajamas. He didn't know what he was doing. He hadn't been around children since his daughter was a teenager, but instincts emerged from somewhere deep within, clumsy but sincere. He boiled water to sanitize a baby bottle and fed Sky slowly, carefully, watching her tiny hands curl against his palm. Malik watched from the couch, his eyes beginning to close as exhaustion overtook fear. Later, after the children had fallen asleep, Sky in a makeshift cradle of couch cushions and Malik curled up on the floor with a blanket tucked under his chin, Harold sat in the armchair, staring into the fire. He felt the weight of everything, the responsibility, the danger, the questions he had no answers to. But he also felt something else. For the first time in years, the house did not feel empty. And that night, in the deepest part of himself, Harold knew, he had taken a step he could never undo. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to. Morning came slowly. Pale light crept through the tall windows of Harold Blake's sitting room, sliding across the hardwood floor like a quiet apology for the night. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the scent of wood smoke lingered faintly in the air. Harold hadn't slept. Not in the true sense. He had dozed in the armchair, never fully letting his guard down, waking each time Sky stirred or Malik shifted beneath the blanket. His old bones ached from the position, and his thoughts felt like they'd been churned in slow circles through the night. He watched the boy first. Malik was still asleep, curled on his side, one hand tucked beneath his cheek, his breathing shallow but steady. The blanket had slipped down to his knees. His face was softer in sleep, his jaw unclenched, and Harold was startled by how young he looked like this. Just a child, not the miniature guardian he'd appeared to be the day before. Skye, bundled securely in her nest of cushions, had woken twice during the night but had gone back to sleep quickly after being fed. Harold had surprised himself with how naturally his arms had remembered the gentle sway and rhythm required to calm a baby. He stood now, stretching stiff limbs, and shuffled into the kitchen. The motions of making coffee were second nature. Grind the beans, fill the pot, press the button. The scent helped center him. As the machine hissed and burbled to life, Harold stared through the kitchen window. Outside, the wind stirred the bare branches of the trees. Winter was coming faster this year. He poured himself a cup and walked back to the sitting room just as Malik stirred. The boy sat up slowly, blinking the sleep from his eyes, his first action to look for Skye. When he saw her sleeping peacefully, his shoulders relaxed just a little. Then he noticed Harold and tensed again. "You hungry?" Harold asked, his voice gentle. Malik nodded. Harold made scrambled eggs and toast, slicing up an apple into careful segments. He placed the plate in front of Malik without a word. The boy hesitated only briefly before eating, though he did so with quiet urgency, as though expecting the food to be taken away at any moment. While Malik ate, Harold prepared a bottle for Skye. The process was clumsy. He spilled some formula and nearly burned his fingers trying to test the temperature, but eventually he managed. When the Skye began to fuss, he lifted her carefully and fed her, sitting beside the fireplace again. Her tiny hands grasped his finger while she drank. Harold stared down at her, feeling something stir in his chest he didn't have a name for. After breakfast, Harold gave Malik a proper bath. The boy was hesitant to undress at first, clutching his filthy shirt with both hands. But Harold said nothing, simply placed a clean towel on the bathroom counter and stepped out, giving him privacy. When Malik emerged 20 minutes later, wrapped in an oversized bathrobe, his hair damp and curling at the edges, he looked a little less like a shadow and more like a boy. They spent the rest of the morning quietly. Harold wasn't sure what to do with a child during the day, so he didn't try to plan much. He gave Malik paper and pencils, found a few old picture books in a box in the guest room, and played soft music in the background. Skye slept often, waking for brief moments to eat and stare with wide, blinking eyes at the world around her. It wasn't until after lunch that Harold finally asked the question he'd been circling since the day before. "Malik," he said gently, "where's your mom?" The boy stiffened. He didn't answer right away. He looked down at his hands, then over at his sister, as if afraid that speaking the truth might somehow wake her from the fragile peace she'd found in this house. "She said she was going to get food," he mumbled at last. "She said it wouldn't take long." "When was that?" 4 nights ago." Harold nodded slowly. "Where were you before that?" "We stayed at a woman's place, Miss Tanya. She had a room upstairs. Mama paid her sometimes, but sometimes we had to leave if she couldn't." He hesitated. It wasn't a real apartment, just a room. "Did Miss Tanya say anything when your mom left?" "She wasn't there. She kicked us out the day before. Mama said we'd stay by the store and she'd come back with food, but she didn't." There was no anger in Malik's voice, just weariness, a kind of resignation that felt entirely wrong coming from a child's mouth. Harold leaned back in his chair, the silence pressing in on him. He knew the streets Malik spoke of. He knew how quickly people disappeared there. Some by choice, some by force. He knew what it meant when a mother left her 2 children behind with no sign and no word. He'd seen it before. In courtrooms, in city shelters, in whispered conversations behind closed doors. But it was different when the children were in your house, drinking your milk, sleeping under your roof. Harold called his assistant in New York that afternoon. Miranda had been with him for years and didn't ask questions unless he offered answers. "Cancel everything on my calendar," he said. "Yes, for the week, possibly longer." "Should I contact Mr. Deason about the estate hearing?" "No, just delay it. I'll deal with it later." He hung up before she could ask more. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees and cast long golden rays across the living room, Harold sat beside Malik on the couch. The boy had fallen asleep again, his head tilted against the armrest, Ska nestled on his chest. Her little fists clutched the fabric of his shirt. They looked peaceful, whole, somehow, but Harold knew better. This wasn't wholeness. This was survival. Later that night, when the children were asleep again, Harold sat alone by the fire. He stared into the flames, letting them burn away the doubt creeping into his mind. He thought of his own daughter, of the way she used to twist her hair around her finger when she was nervous. He thought of the angry letters they had exchanged during the last year of her life, when she had accused him of always trying to control her, of treating emotions like liabilities. She'd been right, and she'd died before he could tell her so. Maybe that was why he couldn't look away from these children. Maybe that was why, when Malik had said, "Please take my sister," Harold had felt like someone had spoken directly to the part of him he had buried with his daughter. He picked up the phone again, this time to call someone else. Her name was Judith Fleming, a retired family lawyer who had once represented Harold's company in a civil suit and later became a trusted advisor in personal matters. She was in her early 60s now, living just 2 counties over. When she answered, her voice was crisp. "Harold, it's late. I know, I need to ask you something. Off the record. Go ahead. If someone, hypothetically, took in 2 children who weren't theirs, no documentation, no proof of guardianship, nothing, what would happen if the authorities found out?" There was a pause. "How old are the children?" 6 and an infant." "Where's the mother?" "Gone. 4 days now." "Father?" "Unknown." Another pause. "Harold," she said quietly, "you need to call Child Protective Services." "I can't. They'll take them away." "That's how it works. They'll put them in the system." "That's how it works," she repeated, more gently now. "I can't let that happen." There was silence again. Then she said, "I'll come by tomorrow. We'll talk." Harold hung up. He looked towards the hallway where the children were sleeping. His house had become something else now. Not just a shelter, not just a refuge. It was something precarious and sacred. He knew the laws. He knew the risks. But he also knew that some things were worth risking, especially when the alternative was leaving children out in the cold. When morning came again, he would have answers to seek, forms to fill, names to learn. But for now, he sat in the glow of the dying fire, listening to the silence that no longer felt empty. For the first time in a very long time, Harold Blake was not alone. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to be. Judith Fleming arrived the next morning just after 10, a leather folder tucked under her arm and a skeptical expression on her sharply angled face. She wore a slate-gray wool coat and boots caked with the dampness of the morning dew, and her hair, once a fiery red, was now a cool silver gathered at the nape of her neck. When Harold opened the door, she looked him over with a measured gaze, her lips pressing into a line that said she wasn't here for pleasantries. Still, she stepped inside without needing invitation. "I brought forms," she said, holding up the folder, "but I also brought questions." "I expected nothing less," Harold replied, his voice even. From the hallway behind him came the faint, melodic giggle of Skye, punctuated by Malik's soft murmuring. Judith raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She followed Harold into the kitchen, where the smell of scrambled eggs lingered. The table was scattered with signs of morning chaos: baby bottles, a half-eaten apple, a sock that had clearly fallen off someone's foot. Judith took in the scene with the kind of look a surgeon might give a strange growth, curious, cautious, but not yet alarmed. Over coffee, Harold explained everything, or as much as he understood. He told her about seeing the children at the bus stop, about Malik's quiet desperation, about the night in front of the fire and the stories that began to pour out as slowly and painfully as blood from an old wound. He admitted, almost reluctantly, how the silence of the house had started to shift, how the walls seemed to listen now, how the rooms no longer echoed with emptiness, but with footsteps and hiccups and laughter. Judith listened in silence. When he finished, she opened her folder and produced a packet of documents, thick with legal jargon and bureaucratic formality. "If you want to keep them here," she said, "even temporarily, you need to apply for emergency guardianship. It's not a quick process, but there are ways to push it through faster if you cooperate fully with Child Services. They'll inspect the home, interview you, and, if the mother is still missing after a certain period, the state will begin proceedings to terminate her parental rights." Harold frowned. "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime, the state has the authority to place the children in foster care." "That's exactly what I'm trying to prevent." "I know," she said gently, "but you have to go through the system if you want to protect them long term. Otherwise, you're just a man harboring 2 minors without legal claim." He didn't reply. Instead, he stared out the kitchen window where, in the backyard, Malik was crouched near the hedgerow, investigating something with the solemn fascination only children could possess. Skye sat in a small portable swing Harold had ordered online the night before, bundled in a sweater 3 sizes too big and watching the world with wide, solemn eyes. Judith followed his gaze. "They look okay," she said after a moment. "Healthier than I'd expect. Malik seems cautious but steady, and the baby, she's alert. I've done what I could." "Clearly," she paused. "It's more than most would have done." Harold said nothing. That afternoon, Harold drove the children to the small medical clinic 2 towns over. He didn't trust the local office to keep their mouths shut, and he wanted privacy more than ever. The doctor, a kindly woman with tired eyes and a calm demeanor, examined both children thoroughly. Skye was underweight but otherwise stable. Malik, unsurprisingly, was mildly anemic and showed signs of prolonged malnourishment. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to justify concern. When the doctor asked if Harold was their grandfather, he hesitated. "I'm the one looking after them now," he said finally. Back at the house, he prepared dinner with Malik's help. The boy didn't speak much, but he peeled carrots with surprising efficiency and stirred soup as though he'd done it countless times. His hands were small but purposeful, and he checked on Skye frequently, as though afraid she might disappear if left unattended. After dinner, Harold found a box of old children's books in the attic. Most were from the days when his daughter had been small, their spines worn and pages smudged with the sticky fingerprints of decades past. He carried them downstairs, blew off the dust, and spread them out across the living room floor. Malik hesitated at first, uncertain whether the books were truly for him. But when Harold sat down and opened one, Reading aloud with a voice rough from disuse, the boy slowly crept closer. He settled beside him, one hand resting protectively on Sky's back as she nursed from a bottle. Harold read 3 stories that night. Each time he stopped, Malik asked for another, his voice small but insistent. It wasn't the books, Harold knew. It was the ritual, the steadiness, the sense that someone was still there when the world had failed. Later, when the children were asleep, Harold sat alone in the dim light of the living room. He thought about Judith's words, about the process, about the risk. And then he thought about Malik's face when Harold had offered him a second bowl of soup, about the quiet way he'd smiled when Sky giggled for the first time during bath time, about the single moment at bedtime when Malik had whispered, "Good night," like he wasn't sure if it was allowed. The house had changed. No longer a mausoleum of memory, it was becoming something alive. The fireplace no longer burned to fill silence. It warmed the laughter of a baby and the quiet hum of a boy who had known too much loss. The kitchen was cluttered now, not from disuse but from life. Bottles, toys, dishes piled beside the sink. There were blankets draped across the couch and a damp towel forgotten near the bathroom door. The place looked like it was being lived in for the first time in years. Harold moved through it slowly that night, turning off lights, adjusting pillows, checking on the children twice before retreating to his own room. He didn't bother setting his alarm. He knew Sky would wake him before dawn. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. It had been decades since he'd felt so tired, not from exertion, but from something deeper, something emotional. A different kind of weariness that came with holding too much hope in a world that could crush it easily. But underneath the fatigue was something else. Purpose. He had spent so many years thinking he was done, that his contributions had already been counted, his legacy etched in stone and ledgers. But these children, they didn't care who he had been. They didn't care about his bank accounts, his buildings, his awards. All they needed was for someone to stay, someone to show up. And maybe, just maybe, he could be that person. He closed his eyes to the soft hum of the heater and the faintest sound of Sky's breathing down the hall. The house didn't echo anymore, and for the first time, Harold realized he didn't want it to. The days began to fall into rhythm. It surprised Harold how quickly life shifted, how seamlessly the chaos of having children folded itself into the corners of his quiet existence. Mornings were no longer silent or slow. They began now with Sky's early cries, her hunger insistent and unwavering. Malik, always the first to respond, would wake even before Harold stirred, padding quietly across the hallway in his 2 long socks to soothe his sister before she could fully break the stillness of the house. Harold, usually moments behind, would find the 2 of them in the kitchen, Sky cradled in her brother's arms, Malik already trying to warm a bottle on the stovetop with a concentration that was both impressive and heartbreaking. There was something deeply unsettling about watching a child do the work of an adult. And yet, Harold couldn't bring himself to correct him most of the time. Malik needed the motion, the responsibility. It gave him a sense of control in a world that had stolen too much from him too soon. On the 3rd morning of their new arrangement, Judith returned with a caseworker. Her name was Angela Simmons, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the stiff posture of someone trained to brace for resistance. She introduced herself politely at the door, her ID badge swinging from a lanyard around her neck, and accepted Harold's invitation to come inside with a quiet nod. She carried a leather satchel filled with documents and forms, her pen already uncapped. Malik was sitting on the living room rug with the Sky in his lap, shaking a rattle gently to make her giggle. When the unfamiliar woman stepped into view, his entire body tensed. He stood up abruptly, holding Skye closer, his chin lifting in quiet alarm. His wide eyes searched Harold's face, desperate for explanation. Harold saw it instantly. The fear. The absolute, frozen terror. He stepped forward. "It's okay, Malik," he said, his voice calm. "This is just a visitor. She's here to talk to me, that's all." But Malik didn't relax. Instead, he clutched Skye even tighter and backed up until his back was nearly pressed against the bookshelf. His eyes flicked towards the door, then the hallway, calculating the path of escape. It wasn't just caution. It was the reflex of someone who had been threatened before. Angela softened her expression. She crouched slowly, keeping her voice low. "Hi, Malik," she said. "I'm not here to hurt you or take you anywhere. I just want to make sure you and your sister are okay." Malik didn't answer. He turned his face slightly away and rubbed Skye's back in slow circles. She was calm, quiet, but sensing his tension, her small hands curled into fists. Angela stood and looked at Harold. "May I speak with you in private?" They moved into the dining room, out of earshot. Harold noticed how the caseworker scanned the house with every step. She noted the childproofing he'd begun installing, the plastic caps on outlets, the safety gate by the stairs, the bottles drying on the rack near the sink. Her gaze lingered on the pile of laundry folded neatly on the couch, the baby monitor on the table. "You've done a lot in a short time," she said finally. "I had help. Judith's been guiding me." Angela nodded. "Still, most people don't go this far, not without being forced." "I wasn't forced," Harold said simply. "I was asked." Angela studied him. "You realize, Mr. Blake, that harboring minors without notifying Child Protective Services could result in criminal charges?" "Yes. That's why you're here now." Her lips twitched in something between admiration and exasperation. "I'm going to need to inspect the bedrooms, interview the boy separately, and I'll have to file a report with the state. There's no avoiding that. I understand. And if we locate the mother?" Harold's chest tightened. "What happens then?" "If she's found and determined to be capable, she could petition to reclaim custody. If not, we begin the process of formal placement, either into foster care or with you, should you choose to file for guardianship." "I'll file," Harold said without hesitation. Angela nodded again, this time with more weight. "That's a serious commitment." "I'm aware." They moved through the house together. Angela was efficient, respectful. She inspected the guest room where Malik now slept, commented positively on the cleanliness, the stocked dresser drawers, the presence of both night lights and a reading lamp. She noted the crib in Harold's room where Skye slept beside his bed and remarked on the bottles in the fridge, the pediatric vitamins on the counter. When it came time to interview Malik, Harold stepped away. From the kitchen, he could hear the murmur of their voices. The questions were gentle, but Malik's answers were slow in coming. Eventually, the two returned to the living room, Malik's face pale but composed. Angela gathered her things and offered Harold a printed copy of the emergency placement application. "I'll submit a temporary report. It will keep them with you for now, but you'll need to complete a full background check, provide financial records, medical clearance, and references, and there will be follow-up visits, possibly more than one." "I'll be ready." Angela gave him a long look. "They're lucky you found them." Harold didn't answer. That night, as he folded clothes in the laundry room, he heard Malik's voice behind him. "Are they going to take us away?" Harold turned. The boy stood in the doorway, his thin arms crossed over his chest. "No," Harold said, setting down the shirt he'd been folding. "Not if I can help it." Malak's jaw clenched. "They always take us away." The words weren't bitter. They weren't even angry. They were just tired, as if he had seen too many temporary homes, too many forced goodbyes. Harold crouched so they were eye to eye. "I told you I would protect you. That hasn't changed." Malak looked away, but Harold saw it, the flicker of something in his eyes. Not belief, not yet, but something close. The following week was a blur of tasks. Harold completed the paperwork, underwent a full medical screening, and opened his financial records to scrutiny for the first time in decades. He contacted 3 people who had once called him a friend, asking them to write letters of character reference. He scheduled a home inspection, purchased a fire extinguisher for the kitchen, and replaced the batteries in every smoke detector. He hired a nanny to assist during the hours when he would need to attend meetings or court dates. Everything became about structure, about proving he was capable, not just legally, but emotionally. Judith remained close throughout the process. She guided him through the bureaucratic tangle, pushed back against overly rigid deadlines, and answered his calls at odd hours when doubts began to creep in. But it was Malak who proved to be the anchor. Every night, as the house fell quiet and Harold sat by the fire reading aloud, Malak would draw. At first, it was simple lines, uncertain shapes, but slowly color emerged. Detail. Entire pages filled with parks, with houses, with rooms. Always the same 3 figures. A man, a boy, a baby. Sometimes they held hands. Sometimes they played catch. Sometimes they just stood in silence, but always together. One evening, Harold found a drawing left on his nightstand. It showed the house from the outside, lights glowing in every window. In the yard stood the 3 figures again, and above them, written in careful, slightly crooked letters, were the words, "Our home." Harold stared at it for a long time. He tucked the drawing into his desk, placed it beneath a stack of important documents, as though it too were proof of something worth protecting. And still, a part of him remained afraid, because he knew all too well how easily something precious could be taken, how the law, the system, even fate could steal away the things you dared to love. But for the first time in his life, Harold Blake was willing to fight. Not for legacy, not for pride, but for 2 children who had trusted him enough to stay. And he would not let them down. The wind shifted in early December, bringing with it the sharp bite of winter. In Willow Creek, the trees were mostly bare, the skies soft with the hue of snow that hadn't yet fallen. The house at the end of Maple Lane, once known for its silence and dust, now glowed in the evenings with golden light that spilled from curtained windows and flickered behind frosted glass. Laughter could sometimes be heard from the porch, small, sudden bursts of joy, and the occasional squeal of a baby echoed through the yard like an announcement that something had changed permanently within its walls. Inside, life had found a rhythm. It wasn't perfect. Sky still cried through the night some evenings, her teething fussiness resisting lullabies and warm bottles alike. Malak had nightmares too. They weren't loud or dramatic. He would simply wake up with wide eyes and sit very still, as if trying to remember where he was and whether he was safe. Harold, who now slept lightly and listened even in his dreams, would rise and find him sitting on the edge of his bed, legs dangling, hands clenched. He never pried, never pressed. Instead, he would offer a blanket and a gentle word, and Malak would crawl back under the covers, his small body curling like a question mark into the mattress. In the daylight, Malik began to bloom. Harold enrolled him in the local elementary school, where he was placed into a second-grade classroom. The adjustment was not without its friction. The first week, Malik barely spoke in class. He refused to make eye contact with his teachers and didn't engage with the other children at recess, but the staff, informed of his background and confidence, made space for his silence. They let him sit in the back. They let him draw instead of write. And slowly, piece by piece, Malik opened. One afternoon, Harold picked him up and was handed a folded sheet of paper by the teacher. On it was a drawing, more refined than his usual work at home. It showed a bridge under construction, thick with details. Beams, bolts, lines of tension cables, even a crane in the corner lifting a triangular girder into place. At the bottom, in all capital letters, Malik had written, "When I grow up, I want to build things that hold together." Harold stared at the paper a long time before folding it carefully and slipping it into his coat pocket. Sky, too, changed rapidly. She learned to sit up by herself, then to clap. She babbled frequently, her voice high and musical. She had a particular fondness for being carried around in Harold's arms, her tiny fingers grasping his collar or his sleeve as if he might disappear if she didn't hold on. Harold, who had once flinched at the thought of being needed again, found her weight comforting. He'd taken to carrying her as he moved through the house, narrating his tasks in a quiet murmur that made her coo and grin. Sometimes he forgot she couldn't understand him and talked to her like an old friend. "I don't know how I got here," he whispered once, brushing a bit of applesauce from her chin, "but I'm not sorry I did." The house itself transformed along with them. Harold hired a contractor to convert the library into a nursery. He kept most of the books, moving them to built-in shelves lining the hallway, and replaced the old walnut desk with a white crib and a plush rocking chair upholstered in pale blue. Malik picked out a mobile of stars and planets that spun slowly when wound, casting quiet shadows on the walls at night. Sky loved it, reaching for the dangling Saturn each time it passed overhead. Malik's room also changed. Once a spare guest bedroom with stiff linens and unused drawers, it now held bright quilts, a beanbag chair, and shelves of books arranged in crooked stacks. A model airplane hung from the ceiling, suspended by fishing wire Harold had found in the garage. Malik had painted it himself, a messy, wonderful combination of blue and orange, and declared it a rescue plane for when things go bad. Harold allowed himself small indulgences. He bought a puppy, a shaggy, excitable mutt from the shelter named Clover, who adored the children with an energy that left her panting by noon. Malik trained her patiently, and Sky squealed with glee whenever the dog licked her fingers. There were muddy footprints on the kitchen floor now, and paw prints on the back door glass, but Harold didn't mind. The mess felt human. On weekends, they went to the park. Harold brought a thermos of coffee and sat on a bench while Malik explored the playground. At first, the boy kept close to Harold, nervous among the clusters of shouting children. But over time, he found his way. He climbed, ran, shouted, and returned to the bench with flushed cheeks and stories about the other kids. Harold listened to every word. They talked more now, the two of them. In the evenings, after Sky had been put to bed, Harold and Malik would sit on the porch or in the living room, sometimes with Coco, sometimes just in silence. One night, as the wind rattled the windows and the fireplace crackled gently behind them, Malik turned to Harold and said, "You know, I used to think adults couldn't change." Harold glanced down at him. "Why's that?" Because every time things went bad, the grown-ups just did the same stuff, yelled or left or lied. Harold was quiet for a moment. That's true sometimes. But you didn't, Malik said, his voice certain. You didn't leave. Harold swallowed hard. He didn't trust himself to speak, so he reached out and put a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. Malik leaned into it. It wasn't perfect. There were still court dates looming, paperwork trailing behind them like a tail they could never quite cut off. Judith kept them updated, appearing with folders and stern advice, but even she had softened. Once, after reading Malik's school report aloud, kind, focused, very intelligent, she had smiled and said, "He's yours already. The rest is just a matter of time." One Thursday evening, Angela returned for a follow-up visit. She walked through the house again, asking questions, checking the rooms. Malik showed her his drawings. Sky offered her a toy with a drool-soaked smile, and Angela finally set down her clipboard. "They're thriving," she said, "and so are you." Harold raised an eyebrow. "I wouldn't go that far." Angela smiled. "You're different from the man I met in the beginning." "Children have a way of demanding that," he said, then more softly, "they deserve it." Before leaving, Angela told him the state was close to locating the children's mother. She had been found in a rehabilitation center upstate, checked in under an alias. She was sober, according to the staff, and participating in a long-term treatment program. "She may petition for custody," Angela said, her tone cautious. "Depending on her recovery, she might be granted visitation. It's too soon to tell." Harold nodded, but the room felt suddenly colder. After she left, he stood in the doorway for a long time, watching the children play on the rug with Clover. The thought of losing them, of returning this world to silence, was unbearable. And yet, it was possible. The law did not care for bonds formed in warmth or trust. It cared for blood, for timelines, for structures. Later that night, Malik drew again. This time, he handed the paper to Harold directly. It was a picture of the three of them walking in a forest, Sky riding on Harold's shoulders, Malik holding Clover's leash. The trees were full of color. The sky above was bright and blue. At the bottom, in small letters, Malik had written, "Let's stay like this." Harold folded the paper and put it into the drawer beside his bed, right beside the first one. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew what he was willing to fight for. And he would, with everything he had. Winter settled over Willow Creek in earnest. The first snow came in mid-December, blanketing the streets in silence. Roofs glistened beneath powdery frost, and the trees outside Harold's house stood like quiet sentinels, their branches heavy with white. Sky watched the snow fall through the living room window with a kind of breathless wonder. Her forehead pressed to the cold glass, her breath fogging tiny circles as she whispered incoherent syllables only she understood. Malik stood behind her, arms folded, his face unreadable. He had never seen real snow before. His childhood had offered him little in the way of wonder. That morning, Harold had shoveled the walk himself, refusing Judith's offer to send someone from town. He needed the distraction, the work, the ache in his shoulders. The visit from Angela still lingered in his mind. The children's mother had been found, alive, sober, and in treatment. On paper, it was good news. It should have felt like relief, but instead, it stirred something more complex: fear, uncertainty, a slow, creeping sense of time running out. He hadn't told Malik. Not yet. There was no need, not until there was something certain to tell. But Harold had noticed the boy watching him more closely, as if sensing the shift in the air. The holidays came quickly. Judith arrived with a small artificial tree and a box of ornaments she had dug out of storage. Malik decorated the branches with cautious enthusiasm, lifting Sky up to let her place the star on top. Harold found himself watching them from the doorway, a cup of tea cooling in his hand, unsure how this life had happened to him. How 2 children and a dog had come to fill the corners of a house that had once held only ghosts. There were gifts, modest ones, a new coat for Malik, puzzles and books, soft toys for Sky. Judith brought homemade cookies, and the 3 of them spent Christmas Eve watching old movies under woolen blankets. Clover snored at Harold's feet, and Sky fell asleep in his lap, one chubby hand curled around the fabric of his shirt. And yet, despite the warmth, the comfort, the quiet rituals they had built together, the shadow of what might come never left Harold's thoughts. The call came one morning, just after New Year's. Angela's voice was calm but direct. "She's filed a petition," she said. "The mother, her name is registered now, Tanya Brooks. She's listed you as a temporary guardian in her affidavit, which works in your favor, but the petition is official. She's asking for custody to be returned upon completion of her program in 60 days. Harold sat very still. Across the kitchen, Malik was feeding Sky her breakfast. Her high chair tray was covered in pieces of banana and cereal. She gurgled happily, slapping her palms in excitement. "What happens next?" Harold asked. "There will be a review hearing," Angela said. "You'll be notified of the date soon. You have the right to contest the petition. But I need to be honest. Reunification is always the goal of the system, unless there's proof that it would cause harm to the children." Harold's grip tightened around the phone. "And what if I petition for guardianship?" "That complicates things. If you can demonstrate that the children are thriving in your care, and that returning them to their biological mother would disrupt their stability or put them at risk, a judge may consider a transfer of custodial rights. But it's a process. You'll need legal representation. I have it. Then prepare yourself. This won't be easy, and it won't be quick." After the call, Harold stood in the kitchen for a long time. He watched Malik wipe Sky's hands with a damp cloth, speaking to her in the soft, patient voice he used only when he thought no one else was listening. She reached for his nose and giggled when he pulled back, laughing with her. Harold's chest ached. That evening, he asked Judith to come over. They sat at the dining table while Malik and Sky played in the living room. "She wants them back," Harold said. "I heard. She's in treatment. Doing well, apparently." Judith nodded slowly. "That's what you'd hope for. But I know that look, Harold. You don't believe she'll stay clean." "It's not about belief. It's about what I've seen. Malik's stories. The way he freezes when someone raises their voice. The way he checks the door every night before bed." Judith said nothing. She didn't have to. "I want to keep them," Harold said. "I want to make this permanent." "Then we file," she replied. "We get letters from his teachers, from the doctor, from the caseworker if she's willing. We build the case. And if I lose, then we appeal. You're not alone in this." The next few weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Harold spent hours compiling documents, attending legal consultations, submitting to home visits and interviews. Malik returned from school with glowing reports. Sky began to take her first steps, wobbling between couch and chair with delighted squeals. And then, one day, Harold came home from a meeting to find Malik sitting at the dining table with crayons and paper, a look of fierce concentration on his face. "What are you working on?" Harold asked, setting down his coat. Malik looked up, hesitant. A drawing? For the judge. Harold's brows rose. I want to show him what it's like here, Malik said, in case he doesn't know. Harold sat beside him, watching as Malik added the final lines to a sketch of their backyard. The swing set Harold had installed stood beneath the snow-covered trees. Clover sat beside it. In the window of the house, 3 faces looked out. Harold, Malik, Sky. I want them to know we're okay, Malik whispered, that we belong. Harold placed a hand on the boy's back. I think they'll see that. The hearing date arrived with the slow inevitability of a train approaching from a distance. On the morning of, Harold dressed Malik in a blue sweater and slacks. Judith came early to help with Sky, who wore a pale yellow dress and a white cardigan that had once belonged to Judith's niece. The courthouse was unfamiliar to Malik, and he held Harold's hand tightly as they walked the halls, eyes darting to the solemn faces around them. Inside the courtroom, Tanya Brooks sat at the opposite table. She was thin, her hair pulled back tightly, her hands shaking slightly as she clasped them in her lap. Her eyes met Malik's only once, and in that moment, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, but not warmth. The hearing lasted nearly 2 hours. Testimonies were read, documents submitted. Angela, to everyone's surprise, spoke in Harold's favor, emphasizing the children's stability, their health, their emotional development since entering his care. When the judge finally spoke, the room fell into silence. This case is not without complexity, he began. The biological mother has made efforts to correct past behaviors, and those efforts are noted. However, the children's current guardian has provided a level of care, stability, and affection that cannot be overlooked. Reunification may remain a long-term goal, but at this juncture, the court finds it in the best interest of the children to remain in their current placement under continued guardianship. There was a pause. Then the gavel struck once, and it was done. Outside the courtroom, Malik sat on a bench beside Harold, his feet swinging above the floor. So, we're staying? He asked quietly. Harold looked at him, at the boy whose trust had been so hard won. Then he nodded. For now, and for as long as you want. Malik didn't say anything, but he leaned into Harold's side, and Harold wrapped an arm around his shoulders. That night, they returned home to the smell of something baking. Judith had left cookies in the oven, and the warmth of the house welcomed them like an old friend. Sky toddled to meet them at the door, arms outstretched, unsteady on her feet but determined. Later, as Harold tucked Malik into bed, the boy hesitated. "Do you think she'll come back?" he asked. Harold considered his answer carefully. "Maybe, but if she does, it won't change how much you're loved here." Malik looked up. "Even if I came from somewhere else?" Harold bent down and kissed his forehead. "Especially because you came from somewhere else." He turned off the light and left the door slightly ajar. In the hallway, Sky waited, clutching her stuffed bear. Harold lifted her into his arms and carried her to the nursery, humming softly as she drifted into sleep. The house was quiet again, but it was no longer empty. It never would be again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more. Check out our next video and explore the rest of our stories. And if this touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to hear it.